I love plant pockets. Plant pockets are just little areas, just pockets that you intentionally leave and put soil and compost in there where you can tuck in little plants that just kind of pop out of the rocks like it does in nature. Columbine, prickly pear, sedums, pussy toes, those are all things that work well in those little areas. And it really just blends that stone a little more seamlessly with the surrounding landscape, makes it look a little more cohesive. Hey guys, thank you for joining us at this webinar, Simple Stonework. My name is Kyle Johnson. I'm the owner of Burr Oak Ventures, the landscape company that focuses on primarily native plants, ecology, and also some hardscape work. I have been working in the industry in various capacities for almost 30 years now. I have my horticulture degree. And yeah, over the years, I've done just about anything and everything in the landscape world. But over probably the last 10 or 15 years, I've really kind of found my passion, found my groove, and what I really like to focus on, which is native plants, ecology, um, working a lot with natural stone, and kind of coming at landscaping from a very natural point of view, not only in terms of um, a habitat and benefiting pollinators and wildlife and things like that, but also aesthetically, stylistically, I really like that theme. When I do a project for a client and they say it looks like this was just always here, that's perfection. That's what I like to go for. So that's how I approach design work, landscaping, and one of the reasons why I really like working with natural stone. It just gives it just a very natural look. So today we will be talking about some different kinds of hardscape projects that are on a little bit smaller scale. With hardscapes, you can do something very simple, or you can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, have a lot of, heavy equipment, a lot of things like that. So we're going to be focusing on things that are the type of projects that are simple, affordable, something that a motivated homeowner with a pickup and shovel and some basic tools can tackle maybe in a weekend or a day, a few days, something like that. So the four main categories that we'll be looking at as far as hardscape projects are going to be boulders and rockeries. Rockery is just kind of a fun word. It involves boulders. It's just a different way to do it, but and we'll get into that. Flagstone, we'll be talking about more like flagstone footpaths, stepping stones. Once you get into flagstone patios, which I love doing, that's kind of next level. There's a lot of prep and it's just a lot more involved. And dry stack walls. Dry stack basically just means there's no adhesive or anything like that. It's just stone that's stacked, and just gravity and how you arrange the stone holds it in place. And dry creek beds. I really like doing dry creek beds. There are a lot of different ways to do them, and some things that you can do as you're kind of designing them and picking your stone and arranging everything that gives it a much more natural, um, kind of a more natural style, will make it a little more interesting. All right, so boulders. One of the reasons I like boulders is they're simple. Um, with a concrete block wall or even a dry stack wall, the base prep is very important because you have to have everything level. All the courses of the stone have to be the same. It has to be consistent. It's a little more forgiving with natural stone, but there's a lot more base prep. Boulders, you can literally just kind of tuck them in place, and it just makes them a lot easier to work with, a little more flexible. Um, don't need any special tools. And boulders, if you are working around trees, we've all seen a lot of tree rings where they're like either dry stack stone or concrete block or things like that. The problem with that is you have to dig a trench around the tree, which cuts a lot of tree roots. With boulders, you can kind of work around the tree roots without harming the tree and cutting roots and things like that. So boulders are very versatile, very flexible, very simple and easy to work with. They're heavy, but um, you get boulders that are manageable. which we'll get into. Dry stack walls, those are a little more architectural, a little more formal style. If you have an area that you want to terrace a little bit or level out, dry stack walls can be good. Just a different style too, with having uniform rows of stone versus the irregularity of boulders. I really like flagstone. I do a lot of flagstone footpaths and stepping stones. Um, Typically in areas where there's already traffic or where there needs to be foot traffic, kind of keeping a path open and but doing it in a way that is very aesthetically pleasing, looks natural. Dry creek beds, the one of the great things about dry creek beds is they solve problems. They solve drainage problems, erosion problems. They're very effective at that if you do them correctly, which we'll talk about. But they can be great for moving, collecting water, stormwater runoff, water from downspouts, or getting water from point A to point B through a landscape to maybe to a rain garden. I'll show you a picture of one that I've done where it was a dry creek bed that ran to a rain garden. This is an example of a project that I've done in the past where been able to combine a lot of different kinds of stone, serving different purposes, doing different things. Those projects are really cool because you can kind of have a lot going on, but if you choose stone that all works well together and kind of pay attention to, the flow, the visually of how everything goes, you can do some really cool things. And this one you can see in the middle, there's actually a bioswale running through there, and the water actually runs underneath the stone slab, but then there's flagstones on either side of it, and then some natural stone, limestone slab outcropping walls around it. Here's another one where there's kind of a variety of elements of different kinds of hardscapes going on. Flagstone and some limestone slab steps and dry creek bed going through the middle. And you'll notice with a dry creek bed, there's a variety of different kinds of stones and some boulders thrown in there. It makes it look a lot more natural and interesting rather than going, in a straight line through the landscape. It kind of meanders through, and that just visually makes it a lot more interesting as well. So we'll get into boulders. Here are a couple of examples of boulder walls. The one on the left is going to be to a scale that, most homeowners are not going to want to tackle that. That's going to require equipment. But it's an example of visually kind of how you can arrange boulders, with some irregularity, make it look a little more natural. Same with the bottom one or bottom right picture. The one on the bottom right is one that I did build by hand, didn't involve any equipment. And a few of those boulders we're pushing the limits of what I can move by hand, but that's something like that is manageable and arranging them with some irregularity, some high spots and low spots. Functionally, it still works, but makes it look a little more natural, gives you some variety. I mentioned rockeries before. Rockeries are basically just a boulder wall that's not continuous. It's not just accent boulders, but it's using boulders to kind of stabilize a hillside, prevent erosion, but also add some visual interest as well. But rockeries, and you can see the upper right one, that slope there was a wall, but didn't want to damage the tree roots by putting that wall any further out there, which I didn't do the wall, it was part of the house, but continuing a wall there would have involved cutting a lot of roots. So doing kind of a rockery like this under there stabilizes the hillside, prevents some erosion, but does it without interfering with the tree. These are a couple examples of stone that was just on site that the homeowners had, and we just, rather than purchasing new material, utilized what they had on site to do just some simple stabilization. The bottom one is a little rain garden, and we just used the stone to kind of confine water, build up a little bit so that we could excavate a little more for the rain garden and it could hold a little more stormwater. The one on the right is also a rain garden that has a downspout emptying into it. And there's a tree right above those boulders. Then doing it this way, just kind of tucking those stones into the hillside allowed us to dig a little bit deeper basin for the rain garden without, again, interfering with the tree roots. Anybody who's worked with me for a while or heard me ramble and rant about natural stone, going back to the doing things naturally, making it kind of going for it. It was always there. Look, I love plant pockets. Plant pockets are just little areas, just pockets that you intentionally leave and put soil and compost in there where you can tuck in little plants that just kind of pop out of the rocks like it does in nature. Things that grow in every crack and crevice that they can, and plants like sedges, columbine, prickly pear, sedums, pussy toes, those are all things that work well in those little areas. And it really just blends that stone a little more seamlessly with the surrounding landscape, makes it look a little more cohesive. And here's a great example of, again, this is limestone slabs. So this is going to be a little bit larger scale than an average DIY landscape, but it shows you how you can do things naturally. And then when you plant around it, and arranging the stone in a way with planting in mind, and tucking plants in right against the wall, right above the wall, things above the wall that kind of spill over, it really gives it that it was always there look. And here's another one, another dry creek bed. You can kind of see, I guess it's kind of hard to see from the top, but there are downspouts uh, on the house, coming off of the house, and rather than putting in a French drain or drain pipe, we just opted to do dry creek beds through the landscape. And you can't really see it very well, but there are intentional basins, I guess, that we left where stormwater can pool and collect and soak into the landscape as it moves through, rather than just getting it down the hillside. So it utilizes that stormwater to water the landscape, and visually it just gives it a really kind of a fun style as the dry creek bed meanders through. But you can also see a variety of different sizes of stones, and we'll talk about kind of what kind of stone to use and why. This is a picture from a different angle of the one I just showed you, where you can see there's another stone slab where the water goes underneath, flagstone going through, connecting everything, giving you access, and a place where you can walk through the landscape just functionally, but also just to enjoy the landscape and move through it a little more easily. Here's another picture from another angle, the other one where it just shows um, just having plants that spill over, tucking plants in, plant pockets, gives it a really cool look. All right, there are a lot of different kinds of stone. These are probably the three main ones that you're going to look at working with if you're doing boulder walls or rockeries or specimen boulders. Granite is definitely one of the most common. Uh, of the stones of these three, granite is going to be the heaviest. So that's something to keep in mind as you are trying to decide how motivated you are to wrestle with some boulders. They're not dramatically heavier than the other ones, but it makes a difference if you're doing a project of a significant size. And all of these are readily available too. Moss boulders, they're more of a sandstone. They're a little bit lighter. Visually, they're just a little more interesting. They have lichen and moss growing on them. And then limestone, I put free because limestone is very common around here. And a lot of times, if you drive by a new development or somewhere where they're doing construction, they'll have a big dirt pile or even a pile of limestone boulders and chunks. And if you can get a hold of the builder, typically they'll let you have as many as you want because they have to get rid of them. But they're also very affordable too if you do need to purchase. One of the biggest, I don't want to say mistakes, but one of the biggest things that can influence um, visually the appearance of your landscaping and making it look more proportionate and to scale with the surrounding landscape or your house is the size of the stone you work with. And if you're working with boulders, I always say to get the biggest boulders that you can safely handle. And that's typically going to be about a 250, 300 pound boulder is about the max size that you're going to want to handle by hand. But that's manageable with one person who's very motivated or two people. That's typically going to be about 1.5 to 2 feet in diameter, roughly. As you're selecting boulders, that's something to keep in mind. Here's what you're going to need for a boulder wall or a rockery. Pretty basic stuff. The a hand tamp, just as you prep where you're going to put the boulders. If you're doing wall and stacking the boulders, if you're doing just a rockery, you don't really need to worry about compaction as much, unless the boulders are really big and might settle. That blue two-wheel dolly, I've had that thing for probably 20 years. I got it from Harbor Freight. It's had a very hard life, but you can get one of those for about 75 bucks. And if you don't have something like that, you can move the stone with. It's a worthwhile investment if you're doing a decent sized project. And as far as fabric goes, you only really need fabric behind boulders if you are stacking them two or three high and making an actual wall, because you don't want soil to erode over time through the cracks and the holes between the boulders, because you'll get settling and um, it may be something that you have to take the wall apart and repair. So putting fabric behind that is definitely a good idea. If you are doing a boulder wall, two or three high, you will want behind the fabric, you excavate enough room for the boulders, and then put the fabric directly against the back of the boulders. And then you put the clean backfill behind the boulders. And for something as simple as a small boulder wall, it's really not critical what kind of stone you use. You just want to use something that is clean. Like you could use pea gravel, chip gravel, smaller river rock, anything like that that just has open space where water can drain through. So here's kind of the general prep work and layout of when you're doing a boulder wall. A couple things to keep in mind as you get started. You really only need to excavate, just maybe a couple inches. And the reason is you want the boulders to look like they are in the landscape, they're tucked down in rather than just sitting on top of the ground. They will settle a little bit, so you don't need to dig much out, but you do want them to visually look like that they were, it gives you that always there look where they're tucked into the ground a little bit rather than just sitting on top of the ground. So as you're thinking about how to approach doing a boulder wall as you're stacking, um, it's really easy to get boulders that are the same size and arrange them in kind of uniform rows. And they stack very nicely that way. So you kind of have to intentionally um, keep that in mind and avoid that, because it looks less natural. Um, it just kind of is less interesting. And so in the upper right graphic, as you're stacking the boulders, you want the top of the boulder, the the bottom boulder as you're stacking them, to be pitched back into the hillside a little bit. Um, Close to level is okay, but you want gravity to kind of be pulling those boulders back into the hillside over time as there's expansion and contraction, freeze and thaw, rather than them potentially rolling forward. You definitely don't want that. On the bottom left, it just shows kind of an overhead view of um, how you can arrange the boulders so they look a little more rustic, a little more natural. One thing to keep in mind is you probably don't want to do this if you have turf grass below that you're going to have to mow and weed eat, because if you create all those cracks and crevices, somebody's going to get very tired of having to weed eat all those little gaps all the time. So that would be a situation where you'd want to make the face of the boulders as uniform as possible, as straight as possible. But if this is in your landscape surrounded by plants or mulch, I would definitely opt to kind of make it a little more irregular. And on the bottom right, it just shows um, kind of the overall look you're going for, an arrangement with having a variety of sizes. So if you're getting a truckload of boulders, pick up some small ones, pick up some small chunks. Those work great for filling in little gaps. And visually, I just think it looks more interesting too, because in nature, that's how it works, is you have boulders fracture over time and kind of break apart and fill in naturally on their own. So step one, you've got your trench dug out and you've got um, the hillside excavated to give you room for some backfill since you'll be stacking boulders. So step two, after you get the first course laid or the starting boulders laid, you'll put the fabric behind the wall. directly against the back of the stone and fill in with your clean backfill and kind of pack it as much as you can because the upper stones may partially rest on that. So you want it to be packed so they don't eventually settle. And you can do that with the hand tamp. You can do that with the butt end of your shovel handle, kind of poke it down in there to settle the stone as well. Step three, you're going to your next course. So you will stack your boulder on again, making sure it's slightly pitching back into the hillside a little bit, and pull your fabric up, and then fill your backfill up to the height of just below the top course of boulders, wherever you're going to stop. And again, if you're arranging them irregularly with different sizes, this is going to have to be flexible. You'll kind of adjust the fabric and the backfill as you're stacking a little bit. But the main thing is you want that fabric to wrap back over the top of your backfill because you'll want soil behind the top course, either for plants or turf grass or whatever. But you want that fabric barrier between the soil on top and the backfill because over time you want to keep that backfill open for drainage so you don't have water accumulating behind the wall. And by folding the fabric back over before you add soil, that prevents the soil from eventually washing down into the backfill. There's really not much soil that's going to move laterally into the backfill from your hillside, so you do not need to have fabric between the soil and the backfill. So we'll get into dry stack walls, and here are um, a few different arrangements. The upper left is 6-inch limestone, and the upper right is also 6-inch limestone. It's just how you arrange it. The one on the left, we put flagstone to extend the patio a little bit, but you'll notice it's not just continuous. There's plant pockets um, that, again, just kind of blends the whole landscape together. And it just, if you're going for a more natural look, it really arranging the stone with some irregularities, some gaps. Um, it just gives it a lot more interesting look. The one on the right was more functional. We didn't really have it was against a flat patio, so we opted to uh, get stone that was more uniform in size, and it's more of just a functional wall, but still using natural stone, so it has a cool look. Bottom left is, I think it's Pecos Tan or James Creek. Everybody's got different names for it, but it's more of a similar to a flagstone. It's a little bit more of a sandy stone type of material. The bottom right, I love the look of this stone, but it is very difficult to chisel and to work with. And when you're working with natural stone, um, that is not saw cut or milled to a perfectly uniform height, you'll have high spots that you have to chisel off so the stone sits flat and doesn't wobble. And I like limestone; it's pretty easy to work with, but the one on the bottom right is very difficult to chisel. It's very hard. It doesn't have a grain where it flakes when you try to split a piece off. But one thing to also be aware of is so on the upper, all these pictures, I guess you can't really, it doesn't really show it in the upper right picture, but the other ones, the color of the stone that I picked matches the house. So the bottom left, it's got some rust in it that matches the color of the brick and the limestone kind of color of the foundation. You can see a little bit of trim on the upper left picture. It's gray. The house has dark gray trim, so we went with a gray flagstone, but the rusty color in the gray flagstone also kind of blends it with the limestone as well. In the bottom right, the house is gray, so we went with a gray stone, just so that everything, even though you're using natural stone, you want it to be a color that matches the house and the surroundings. Here are a couple other examples of kind of the opposite ends of the spectrum as far as dry stack walls. The ones on the left, those are 6-inch limestone slabs. Just a very simple, natural arrangement with some gaps and irregularities. Looks more like a little outcropping wall. The one on the bottom right is actually a milled stone. I'm not sure what kind of stone it is, but it is milled, and it can be milled or saw cut to give it a perfectly uniform appearance. And also it makes it very, very easy to work with. So when you're picking what kind of stone you want, I mentioned the milled and saw cut stone, the limestone, the 6-inch limestone that I've shown in previous pictures. It is with a machine, they chop it or snap it so that it breaks, and they can break it into fairly consistent thicknesses and sizes, but it will have irregularities that require some chiseling and some sculpting a little bit to make it all fit together and not wobble, and all the courses to sit flat on top of each other. The milled or saw cut stone, the faces are snapped or chopped, so they're still rough, but the top and bottom of the stone is machined to make it all a uniform thickness, and that's typically 3, 4, 6 inches thick. It varies, but it's very easy to work with. It's more expensive because of the extra processing, but if you're doing a smaller project where the extra cost is negligible, it might be worth it. Or if this is your first hardscape project and you want something that's going to be easy to work with, that would be good. It also gives a much cleaner look, since it's machined to be all the same, perfectly same thickness. You can also get stone that is tumbled, where they just put the stone in a big tumbler and it kind of rounds off the edges. The picture on the last slide, the one on the bottom right, is milled and tumbled as well. Again, that does add to the cost, so that's something to keep in mind. So when you're figuring out how much stone you need, wall stone is measured in face feet, and what that means is it's just the surface of the wall that you can see. It's not only what's visible, but if it's whatever courses are buried as well. So it's the full face of the wall, the square footage. So as you're figuring out how much stone you need, how many face feet you need, the vendor you get the stone from typically can tell you, 1 ton of stone is going to get you roughly 15 to 20 face feet of wall. So that makes it kind of easy to calculate. If you're doing a dry stack wall, these are a couple of things you'll need. The fabric again, and with the fabric, I should mention, don't get cheap fabric. You want to get heavy duty fabric, because you want that to hold the soil or backfill back from coming through the front of the wall for the life of the wall. And cheaper fabric will tear, it will split, and then you'll have maybe eventually wall failure. So if you're going to Menards or Lowe's, someplace like that, get the heaviest duty fabric they have. They usually say it's like a 20-year fabric or 50-year fabric. Get the heaviest duty fabric that you can, and it can be either black or gray are typically the colors that are the heavy duty fabric. With dry stack walls, you will also need crushed rock for your base as you're leveling, for the wall to sit on. And this is what I like to use for smaller dry stack walls, because you can use it for base and you can use it for backfill. So you don't need to get several different products. You can just use this for everything. It goes by a lot of different names depending on where you get it from, what part of the country you live in. It can be quarter clean, chip gravel, chat, buckshot, quarter-inch chip, but it's all the same. It's basically just quarter-inch clean chips of limestone. And you can typically get this in bags as well. So here's what you need for doing a dry stack wall. You'll want a 4-foot level to level the stones with one another as you're setting your base course. A little torpedo level is easy for leveling individual stones front to back. Mini sledge for chipping and shaping the stones. Mason's chisel for knocking off high spots and kind of shaping the stone or splitting the stone as needed, which we'll get into. If you have an angle grinder and you can put a diamond wheel on it, that can make it a little bit easier. You can score the stone and it breaks a little bit more easily. You're not swinging a hammer so much. And a hand tamp for base prep or prepping the trench for the wall. If you want an excuse to buy some fun tools, here's a couple that are good investments if you're doing a decent sized project or if you plan on doing more in the future. Again, or if you just want an excuse to buy some cool tools. The electric mini demo hammer is basically just a handheld jackhammer. It it makes shaping the stone so much faster rather than chiseling, and much easier as well. Um, the concrete saw is, kind of a step up from an angle grinder. But again, if you're doing a decent sized project with a lot of curves, you're going to have to do a lot of cutting. And so this may be a worthwhile investment. And sometimes you can find them used. So here's a project I did recently, and I tried to document the process thoroughly, just to walk you through what it would be like to do a dry stack wall on your own. We've got the uh, trench excavated, and you want to get that as close to level, not only from end to end, but front to back, as much as possible. And you can see on the right side, the hill does slope up, so we will be stepping the wall up one course, and I'll kind of show you what that looks like. And when you're digging out the trench for your wall, um, you want probably about 3 or 4 inches of base of the chip gravel or buckshot, um, to go underneath the wall to level the area. But then you also want at least most for a smaller wall. You don't have to bury a full stone course, but you want at least most of the bottom course of the wall buried below grade, and that will hold the wall in place over time. Especially like this, where it's on a slope, you don't want the base course of the wall to move at all. So you want that bottom course either completely buried or mostly buried. But here's the step up. So on this wall, we're using a 6-inch stone. So our trench jumps up 6 inches to account for that, the wall stepping up. So here's us starting to build the wall, doing the base prep, hand tamp the trench very thoroughly just to pack that soil. And we've got our bags of buckshot there, filling the trench. And then on the right, you see we've got the level there, and it is perfectly level, I'm pleased to say. But you want to get that trench as level as possible. The sense of the stone, if you're not working with a saw cut stone, the stone will be a little bit irregular, so you'll have to set each stone individually and adjust a little bit, but you want to start out as level as possible. So we're setting our first stone. We have our dead blow hammer, um, sand hammer, dead blow hammer. They go by a couple different names, but you'll want one of those to knock that stone in place. You you'll want to make sure it goes down as far as it will go, but so you may need to put the stone in. If it's not perfectly level, pull a little bit of gravel out, add a little bit more, but then every time you move the stone, reset it with the dead blow hammer, and then check your level side to side in front of your back and front to back. So we are continuing with the base course, and we want to level each stone. On the right there, you can see we have our 4-foot level, making sure each stone is level with the adjacent stone, so they're all the same height, but then each stone is also leveled front to back as well. So something to keep in mind as you're thinking about doing a stone project is, like, if it's going to have a lot of curves, that's going to require a lot more chiseling, a lot more cutting, because if it's an inside curve, um, you can see you have to cut the backside of the stones. If it's a very gradual curve, you may not have to cut the back corners off of each stone. Sometimes you can do every other stone if it's a gradual curve. On a tight curve like this, you typically have to cut the back corners or chisel the back corners off of all of the stones, um, just so they all fit tightly together. And because you want the seam on the face of the stones to be tight and not for there not to be a gap between them. On an inside curve, the faces all mate together tightly on their own, but then you have big gaps on the back. Uh, Structurally, that doesn't affect anything. That's fine as long as you split the seams and stagger your stones so that the seams don't line up as you're building the wall. You definitely don't want that. You want the seams to alternate between the rows. But if you have a really tight inside curve, the gaps are pretty big, and it's typically a good idea to take some of the pieces that you chisel off of other stones and just kind of pack them in there before you put the fabric behind it. That just prevents the fabric from kind of getting pulled into those gaps over time and then stretching and potentially tearing. And that's again why you don't want to use the cheap fabric because that will tear. But as you stack the stone, the on an inside curve like that, that's fine except for the top course. You'll want the seams where the stones mate with one another to be perfectly tight all the way across, which we'll get into. So on the left side, you can see where we've stepped up. Um, you want to have the center of the stone directly over the end of the bottom course, or at least a substantial amount hanging over, just for stability, so that you don't have a stone that's just kind of teetering on the edge. In the middle, you can see there we've got our top course set, and we've shaped the top course of stones because you can see the top of the wall. We don't want gaps, so we shape those stones so that the gaps front to back are all tight. And then we have excess fabric, so we're just cutting off the extra before we overlap it over the top of the backfill and add soil behind the top course. And there's the finished wall. Fairly simple, but it definitely um, solved the issue of having a really steep slope there in erosion where we can kind of terrace it a little bit. And you can just kind of barely see the bottom course. The sod is kind of sticking up a little bit, but we have um, almost the whole bottom course buried, and that just keeps the wall stable and keeps it from going anywhere over time. All right, let's talk about Flagstone. These are all some examples of projects I've done where either there was already foot traffic through here, keeping the path, worn, being muddy when it's rainy. This solves that problem, and it makes it just aesthetically, it just makes it look very natural and inviting. That's one of the things I really like about Flagstone is, especially if you have kind of a meandering path like this, it's just very inviting, and you just kind of want to walk down there and see what's at the other end. The bottom left picture is one that's a fairly large native bed that we did. And this one visually, it adds some style to it, but also it's functional because you need to get in your landscape to do maintenance. You need to be able to walk through it when you're not stepping on plants, but you also don't want just mud or things like that. So this path is functional in that it allows you to move through the landscape, but also you want to be able to just, if you have pollinators and a lot of fun plants, you want to be able to get in there and like enjoy the landscape completely. So when you're choosing your flagstone, kind of getting an idea of what to work with, I really like flagstone that's about an inch and a half thick, kind of in that range. When you get down into thinner stone that's only about an inch, it just isn't as sturdy. It's more likely to crack if you drop something on it, or just crack over time just because it's thin. You can get thick flagstone too, up to like 2.5, 3 inches. That's overkill for what we're doing. It's just unnecessarily heavy. It takes a lot more prep work. It's harder to work with. So inch and a half is kind of the sweet spot when you're doing something like this. It's sturdy enough, but it's not unnecessarily bulky and heavy. And less weight also means it's cheaper when you're doing a project of any decent size. So when I'm doing stepping stones, I like to do stepping stones that are in the range of 18 to 24, probably typically closer to the 18 range, but having a few larger ones in there makes it a little more interesting. It's also good to have larger stones. I like to have a little bit larger stone at the entrance and exit of a path. It just kind of caps the ends off a little more nicely, but also, yeah, just having a variety of sizes and shapes also just makes it a little more interesting. And if you're working with Flagstone stepping stones that are about an inch and a half thick, roughly 18 to 24 inches. Those stones are each going to weigh about 50 to 75 pounds. And so, as you're figuring out tonnage, pricing out a project, 1 ton of flagstone of that size will yield about 25 to 30 stepping stones. So, something to kind of keep in mind as you're calculating your materials. Here are the tools that you'll be needing for doing flagstone. Sometimes you can pick out, hand pick your flagstone. Especially that's practical if you're not doing a lot of stepping stones. If you are doing a fairly long path, you may be looking at getting like a ton or two, a pallet of stone maybe delivered. And at that point, you'll have to do a lot more shaping to get the sizes of stepping stones that you want. Um, 4 foot level is handy for just making sure that your stones are all relatively even with one another. Level isn't critical with what we're doing. It's more of just making sure you don't have a stone sticking up and a tripping hazard. If you have an area where drainage is an issue, torpedo level can be handy just to kind of give you an idea of what level you're working with. A mini sledge for shaping the flagstone is good. I like getting one with a chisel back on it. That just works really well for kind of scoring flagstone and breaking it into pieces. Mason's chisel is also good for if you need to break larger pieces of flagstone. An angle grinder with a diamond blade can be handy for scoring the flagstone, making it a little easier to snap, or if you need to control where it breaks a little more. That's a little bit more precise than a chisel or a hammer. You'll want the buckshot to extend a little bit outside of the edge of the stone just to provide a little bit more stable base. And what you can do if you have a stone that's wobbling is you can stand on the stone and then with your dead blow hammer kind of pack the come at it from an angle and kind of pack the soil and the buckshot in around the edges, especially at the corners. That'll keep it from wobbling or moving as you're stepping on them. So this is kind of illustrating a not a common mistake, but something that can be you may not account for as you're laying out your flagstone. So when I'm doing a flagstone path, I always lay out my flagstones, shape everything, get it the way I want it before I set anything, and then I go through and set all the stones. But as you're laying out the flagstones, the temptation may be to have all the gaps between the flagstones consistent. That makes sense. And visually, that looks good. But that may mean that um, as you walk on the flagstone, your foot is falling in between flagstones on the edge. The average human stride is about 21 to 22 inches. And so I lay my flagstones out according to that rather than even gaps because the flagstones are always going to be different size, different shape. And so some gaps may be closer than others. Some stones may be long enough that you can have 2 footsteps on one stone. Basically, you want to be able to walk from, one end of the path to the other without thinking about it, without looking down at your feet, making sure you're stepping on the stones. You want to arrange them in a way so that you can just walk through the flagstone path without thinking about it, and your foot will fall on the stone every time. Dry creek beds are a lot of fun. There are kind of different ways you can approach it, different kinds of stone you can use. The picture on the right, or the left, sorry, this one has stone edging around the landscape beds. And so I picked a stone edging and boulders and river rock that's all blends together. You don't have to do that, but I just chose to do that with this one. And you'll see the stone edging is low on the center. That's one thing that's critical with a dry creek bed is making sure that water can freely flow in and out of the dry creek bed. And you may have water flowing in from the sides of the dry creek bed and at the starting point. But wherever you do that, you want to make sure that water can freely flow in there. So you want to make sure that there's nothing impeding it. Um, that the inlet is low enough that water, even in a heavy storm, it all gets directed to the center of the dry creek bed. And then that your dry creek bed is low enough in the center. So when you excavate out for the dry creek bed, you are excavating for not only the river rock or the cobblestones that you're using, but also the leaving room in there for the water as well. So if you were making a dry creek bed that's, say, 2 feet wide and you're using river rock or cobblestones that are 4 inches, you'll want to excavate down, um, deep enough so you're accounting for 4 inches of stone, but then also having, probably another 4 inches on top of the stone for the water that's going to flow through there, because the water doesn't flow through the stones. In a storm, it flows over the top. So you want to have plenty of room above the stones for the water and have it deep enough so that in a storm, it's not going to escape and wash out into a landscape or certainly not a basement or something like that. So the picture on the bottom right, it's a fairly small area, but there's a lot of water that flows through here. So they have their downspouts, and then the neighbor uphill, there's a hillside above it to the left, and then they have all their downspouts running right into here. So this client actually had major problems with their with water getting into their basement. So we excavated down quite a bit to make sure that in heavy rain, that dry creek bed can handle all the water that's going to go in there. And then we also built up against the house with good positive drainage away from the house, just to make sure that when we get one of those 6 inch rains, that that it's not overflowing out of the dry creek bed into the basement or anything like that. And this did solve the problem. One thing also to keep in mind is on the downspouts on the bottom right picture, um, the water just comes out the elbow there. There's not an extension on there. Um, you can leave the extension on and start the dry creek bed out further away from the house. If you do have downspout water enter the dry creek bed against the house, you want to make sure that there's plenty of slope, there's plenty of room for the water to, as it rushes out of there, that it's not going to splash or flow back to the house or anything like that. And one way you can do that is that you can ensure that water isn't collecting or getting against the foundation is you can actually use a piece of like a scrap of pond liner put underneath there a couple feet out just to make sure that there's no water penetration. And again, make sure it's deep enough so that in a heavy rain, all that water can collect in there and get directed away from the house. Again, don't cheap out on fabric. It's worth the investment. And you use the same fabric pretty much for any of these projects, just something heavy duty. So you'll excavate for the dry creek bed and lay this fabric down everywhere. And it really doesn't matter. Sometimes with drainage, you want to overlap the seams of the fabric so that it's kind of a shingled effect so that water doesn't flow underneath the bottom layer. You're going to have, a heavy weight of stone on top of there, so that's not really critical. But a level is definitely handy just to make sure you have consistent fall from one end of the dry creek bed to the other, so water's getting to where it needs to go. This is especially important if you're working with a fairly flat area. You want to make sure that from one end to the other, you don't have anywhere that water is going to back up or collect and overflow out of the dry creek bed. So what I like to do is I like to use cobblestones typically for a dry creek bed. That's just large river rock. Depending on what kind you get, where you get it from, that might be 2 to 6, 4 to 6, 2 to 8. It varies a lot what size, what size combinations it comes in. But I use that for my base, and then I like to, if I can, I like to go over the top of it with a smaller river rock as well, like 1 inch or 2 inch. But the reason I do that and top dress with a smaller stone is that smaller stone kind of settles into the big gaps between the bigger cobblestones. Um, and that's really helpful if you have an area that has a lot of trees because leaves collect in the gaps of bigger stones. And if you, more so than if you use if you use all like 1 or 2 inch river rock for the whole dry creek bed, you'd have very little problems with leaves getting snagged in there. But visually, it doesn't look as interesting. So using a variety of stone like this with some boulders, it makes it a lot more visually appealing. But doing a smaller stone in there, it will fill those gaps so that it's much easier to keep that dry creek bed clean in the fall when you have leaves falling. In the picture on the bottom right, there's actually a rain garden in the front yard um, that all this water goes to, and it needs to be about 4 times as big as we made it just because there's so much water that goes through here, but it works really well. And this one on the bottom right, it's a little bit more basic just because this is a side yard. You're not going to really see it as much. It's more functional. So we didn't get too carried away with boulders and things like that. But you may notice there's a flagstone footpath coming off there, and we did put two flat boulders on either side of the dry creek bed there to serve as stepping stones. You want to keep that in mind. You know, at some point you're going to need to walk through there, and you want to um, make that as easy as possible. So we just put those there just to serve as stepping stones, but still left a big enough gap in there the water can flow through. Kind of already talked about most of this, but yeah, making sure the water can flow freely in and out of the dry creek bed is very, very important. Excavating, leaving enough room for your river rock plus plenty of capacity. You want to, when you're building any sort of stormwater infrastructure like this, you kind of engineer it or design it and build it to account for kind of an average rainfall, maybe 1.5 inches. But you want to build it in a way so that if you do get a 6 inch rain, 8 inch rain, something like that, you know, it may not be able to handle that well, but it will handle it well enough so that the dry creek bed isn't going to wash out, all the water isn't going to go into the landscape or into a basement like we talked about. All right, that's what I've got.
Wonderful. Kyle, that was incredible. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Okay, well, we're going to jump into some questions we have from our audience, some really good ones here. Starting us off is Christine's question about zoysia. What kind of edging to keep turf from growing into a project, she asks. She hates her zoysia. I
Yeah,
also hate Bermuda grass, but it came with the house. Do you have any suggestions there?
that's a really tough one. Zoysia and Bermuda grass, they are just so aggressive. They can go through a crack in a driveway from one side to the other. There's really uh, what I've done in the past is using something like, I mean, you can use timbers, you can use, you have to have a pretty substantial, um, if you use stone edging, using a wall stone. I've done that before, where actually using like a 6 inch wall stone um, as edging and, having
To
that.
like bury it in into the
Yeah,
soil?
yeah, because typically those like a 6 inch limestone wall stone is going to be about like 8 or 9 inches, somewhere between 8 and 10 inches deep, like from front to back. And so if you turn that on, dig a trench, turn that on edge, you can do it that way and kind of build a build a mini wall, leave, have probably half the stone buried, or maybe 2/3 of the stone buried, and leave 2 or 3 inches sticking up that you can weed against to keep the runners from going over the top. But what I would
Hmm.
do in that situation, what I've done before, it seemed to work fairly well. Excuse me. Is actually when you dig the trench for the wall, wrap the full trench in fabric and
Mm.
put rock in there and then set your stones in that. And because between um, the seams of the stone, the zoysia will get through there. But if you line the whole thing and kind of wrap the whole thing in fabric, then it can't get through the fabric or anything like that. So, and get the seams of the stones as tightly as you can. That's or use like timbers, like a 6x6 timber that can work. But zoysia is very challenging. It just is aggressive and it will exploit any crack, any crevice, any seam that it can.
Got to give it up for that in terms of tenacity and resilience, I guess. But
Yeah.
boy, howdy.
Yeah.
All right. We've got a question from our friend Teresa. Do you have any advice on combining different types of hardscape?
Yeah. A few of the pictures back kind of showed some dry creek bed, flagstone outcroppings. So if you have multiple issues that you're trying to solve, like maybe some erosion, maintaining some open access for foot traffic, things like that, I would say just kind of try to get an accurate picture of what you want each of those things what to do in the landscape, what function they need to serve, and then if you're working with a slope and drainage, and so maybe you can do like some boulder walls or rockery to kind of stabilize the slope in some spots and kind of terrace a little bit, not really terrace, but just kind of arrange the stones so that you leave a gap in between the dry creek in the boulders so water can flow through. So you kind of have a lot of different things to fit together, but it certainly can. So I would say kind of figure out um, what the function of each one of those things needs to be, and then where foot traffic naturally goes, where water naturally flows, and work with that rather than uh, try to like force water to go somewhere it doesn't want to go. But then, um, yeah, just kind of play with how to make it all fit together, try some different things, and it can even be too where sometimes you can use a software or program that can do that, or it can be as simple as cut out some pieces of cardboard and just kind of lay them out where you want your stepping stones to go, or take a garden hose and lay it out where the dry creek bed might go. Kind of some things like that. If you have an open space like that that you can work with, just because it can be really hard to visualize, if you have a lot of different things going on, it can be overwhelming to try to figure out how to fit all that together. But if you kind of, yeah, cut out some pieces of cardboard, just put some boxes where boulders or walls might go, just kind of work with what you have, and that'll probably give you a good start on um, visualizing everything and how all the different pieces might fit together. So,
I love that, especially the like utilizing cardboard boxes
mhm.
or pieces of cardboard, a hose, like being able to put that out in your space and physically see these different like spatial relationships. I
Yeah.
think that is awesome. I love that. And I'm gonna definitely do that in my own landscape. So okay. Um, so let's talk a little bit about fabric.
Mhm.
You already mentioned it earlier, but if you could remind us what kind of fabric that you use, and then um, let's see. And we had a question that was related. Christine asks if you've ever used pond liner near the house over the fabric in a dry creek bed. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So I mentioned doing that where if you have downspouts entering into a dry creek bed right next to the foundation, using some pond liner there, wrapping it up against the foundation just to kind of prevent water from going toward the foundation and being able to get back behind there. That can be a really good idea. You can also leave it, like I said, leave the extension on so that the water doesn't leave the downspout till it's further out away from the house. But um, I I don't use I don't think I've ever used pond liner in a dry creek bed, like in the landscape. The fabric, I guess if you have an area where if you're close to a house or something like that where you don't want water going into the ground at all, pond liner can be a good solution. Typically, that's not needed. It's minimal water typically infiltrates through fabric in a dry creek bed most of the time. If it's a really shallow grade and water may take its time moving through the landscape and it's somewhere you don't want water, pond liner might be a good idea. I would say very rarely would it be something that would be needed, but it is an option if there are water concerns in the area where you need to where you're thinking about putting a dry creek bed.
Okay. And as a related question, Joe asks if fabric stops water from seeping down.
Not completely. The fabric is designed to let some water through. It does. Most of the water is flowing through the dry creek bed, so but the water that does collect in between the stones after a storm event, that water will soak into the landscape. It's usually pretty minimal. But in one of the pictures where it was a dry creek bed coming off the going down the hillside through the landscape, that can be advantageous, and you can you like create places like intentionally where water can collect and absorb into the landscape, and it will soak through that fabric slowly. But the amount of water that goes through in a rainstorm is minimal.
Okay. Okay, we're going to shift elements and go from water to stone. So we have a few really great questions from our audience member here. We'll start off with Kevin's question. Kevin says they've heard that some of the free limestone from construction sites will shatter or crumble during the winter because of the moisture trapped within the stone. Is this true? Have you seen this in your own experience?
Um, so when they quarry that's a great question. When they quarry limestone, like if you're buying limestone from a stone supplier, the stone that they quarry at a lower depth is going to be more dense and less porous. There will be less water absorbed into it. The stone that is going to be, unearthed during excavation on a job site will be obviously from, the top of the a higher elevation. It's mixed in with soil, and so it may not be as dense. I haven't had issues with it shattering. It it's hard with natural stone. Every stone is different. You never know, there are variables. And so with some stone, you will get more cracking and spalling and flaking over time. That will happen with all natural stone over time. It's hard to really know which stone will do it and which won't, just because there's so much variation. But in general, I haven't had enough issues with that for it to be a concern, I guess, especially if it's freestone. You may not want to build a big wall out of freestone if there are concerns about failure, just because you don't really want those variables not working in your favor and a wall that's next to your house or a patio where crumbling might be a problem. But if you're doing a rockery or something small, something in the landscape, I would say the risk is pretty low, and you should be pretty safe to get stones. But if you're picking out stones on a job site, um, stones that are really chalky or have a lot of cracks or things like that, sometimes visually you can just kind of see that that stone has some internal issues and maybe not be a good one to choose. But in general, the risk is pretty low. I haven't really had um, many issues over the year.
That's fantastic to hear, Kyle, because I have a ton of limestone that was unearthed from my cousin's various home projects here at my house.
Mhm.
And I went ahead and used it in my backyard to create just like a little edging around my garden, and I love
Yeah,
it. But in general, I'm a big proponent of if you have something on site already, try to use it as much as possible and be resourceful as
absolutely.
possible.
The price is right.
That's right. Free's best for me.
Hmm.
Okay, so related, I've got two more stone questions. This one comes from Lindsay. What is your source for stone, specifically flagstone or limestone in the KC Metro? Do you have preferred places you like to shop for rocks?
I do. Unfortunately, the place that I got all my big 6-inch limestone slabs went out of business. So,
Darn.
yeah. But House of Rocks,
Mhm.
that's kind of my go-to. There are different places around town that do have
Have you
some.
ever been to Sturgis?
I've been to Sturgis. Yep, Sturgis is a good place. It's typically a little bit more out of the way from where I work. So sometimes I get stone from um, wherever's closest to the job site if I can get what I need. But
Sure.
if I'm getting flagstone, it's almost always House of Rocks. I can typically always find the sizes that I need, the and thicknesses that I need. They usually have a pretty good amount to choose from. Sturgis would as well, but and they have the 6-inch, the smaller pieces of limestone, the dry stack walls.
Mhm.
But yeah, either Sturgis or House of Rocks is probably, and
Nice.
I'm pretty sure both of those places deliver too. So,
They do. I can tell you that because we've used rocks from both of these places
mhm,
at the Discovery Center. But I really
yeah,
like Sturgis because you can drive around and look at cool rocks, and I think that's just a fun thing.
you
So
definitely you can't really do that at the House of Rocks.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a little more congested. Sturgis, yeah, Sturgis is a easy place to navigate.
yeah. Okay, I've got just two more questions here, and then we'll wrap up today's presentation. This came from Anonymous. You talked about building stairs into a limestone drywall. Is there a limit to height or number of stairs? And maybe you covered this a little bit, but could go back in depth.
Great question. Yeah, I do kind of going back to always being mindful of where you naturally walk through the landscape, where you need to be able to get from point A to point B. If you're putting a wall somewhere where you normally walk, especially if you're using like the dry stacked stone, that's one of the reasons I like the 6-inch limestone. It's fairly affordable, it's easy to work with, and you can use those to make just a small foot staircase in there. There's really not a limit. Um, Shoot, there's a project I did where I did fairly good size limestone staircase. I wish I would have put that in there, but um, yeah, it really the higher you go, you just have to be really mindful of base prep. So every time you step up, so if you're doing limestone wall and you're just doing, maybe 2 or 3 steps, you can just kind of incorporate that into the wall. If you're extending beyond that, you just need to make sure that as you are, you set one step and then prep for the second one, you want to dig out a little bit of soil behind the step you just set, um, hand tamp that really well and level it with like the buckshot, and then set that stone on there. Um, and you can just I mean, you can really just keep doing that indefinitely. It's just you want to make sure that you're prepping the base well and that those stones pitch forward just very slightly. So setting a level on there to make sure the water isn't draining back into the staircase, that it's actually flowing over the top. But one thing to keep in mind too is as you're putting a staircase in, you don't want to create erosion on the sides of the stairs.
Mm.
So it may be that you need to kind of um, incorporate little terraces as if you're going up building a staircase that's maybe 10 building a staircase that's maybe 10 stones high, you'll probably end up needing to do a little bit of terracing on either side because otherwise you can create a path for water to run along either side and then erode the stairs. So you don't want to do that.
Okay, well, that's all really good information. We have time for one more question, and we'll try to do this rapid fire so we can get you back to your place here.
Right on.
Um, awesome. Okay, this question comes from Laura, and Laura says that she's had groundhogs, mink, muskrats, all kinds of critters dig out the dirt behind and under a cement wall. Animals have been relocated. Cement wall and sidewalk cap is in great condition. What are your recommendations for backfilling the depths and bringing dirt back to refill native beds where animals exited? She
Hmm.
also notes that flagstone patio on the other side of the native beds originally had originally had gravel in lower depths.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges of creating habitat. Um,
If
is
you plant it, they will come.
Yes, I've had chipmunks chew pond liner. They've gotten underneath the pond liner and water features and chew holes in it from underneath, which is a very big problem. It's really hard to effectively discourage animals like that are just diggers and that are burrowers. Sometimes you can, if you're in an area where you have a lot of chipmunks or animals with a lot of digging, that do a lot of digging, and you anticipate that will continue to happen. Typically, it's overkill, but if you're doing some sort of hardscape feature, whether that be a wall or a flagstone patio or something like that, um, the quarter-inch or half-inch hardware cloth, the metal galvanized hardware cloth, that can create a barrier that will keep them out, but um, you have to put it along all the edges of a patio or behind an entire wall. So if you're doing a boulder wall, you could do the fabric behind the boulders and then hardware cloth behind that, and then backfill behind that. That would be effective. But that's tough because chipmunks and they'll find any way in that they can. But if you have an area like that, like a sidewalk or driveway that's been undermined, and the animals have been relocated, you could use like the buckshot. I mean, you could mud jacking, having somebody, well,
Mhm.
that's foam, that's probably not going to work. Um, but you could pack buckshot in the holes and um, with a shovel handle or a broom handle, it, pack it as far,
Shove it in.
yeah, pack it as far in there as you can to really fill those voids. But a smaller stone like the buckshot will fill those voids pretty well. They could dig it out in the future though, so it may be something where, yeah, it's tough. I mean, you may have to like dig a trench next to the concrete, and after you've done the repairs, put hardware cloth, maybe 6, 8 inches down, along the whole perimeter of the concrete or patio or whatever it is where they've dug, just to prevent them from getting back in there. But that's
Well, yeah.
that's one option anyway. That's a tough one though.
I think that's really good advice, though. Putting something impermeable and perhaps something they won't want to chew through, like
Yeah.
buckshot or hardware cloth. I think those are great recommendations. So perfect. Okay. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for lending your expertise today during Curious by Nature with Deep Roots. We had so much fun learning about hardscaping and simple solutions for using stonework in our own landscapes. And special thanks to our wonderfully engaged audience for all of your great questions. So I hope you
Absolutely.
all will tune in next time for Curious by Nature with Deep Roots on Thursday, September 3rd, as we hang out with our friends at Casey Wildlands and learn more about seed stewardship and invasive species management. Thanks all. Take care. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.